Now it's time for today's perspective. And what would you say are the major problems facing the planet? Climate change, of course, but also perhaps poverty and conflict. And all of those issues, especially the last two, are fully in the remit of my guest today. Olivier De Schutter was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. And for the last 3 years, he's expanded that remit, really, and is now Special Rapporteur on human rights and extreme poverty. He has a new book. It's called Changer de boussole, literally change your compass or perhaps change your perspective. It argues that we should abandon our constant search for growth. And he joins me here on set. Thanks very much for coming in to talk to us. I'm going to talk about the book in a moment. First of all, let's talk about some of the issues. I mean, poverty and food access. 800 million people unsure of where their next meal is coming from. Figures are rising as well, aren't they? Some of these figures are doubling in just a few years. I mean, we're plainly doing something wrong, aren't we?
Well, for many years we've been making progress on this front of combating hunger, but over the past 3 or 4 years, the figures are alarmingly rising again. That is a result of a combination of certain conflict zones, people migrating from one place to the other as a result of these conflicts, climate change, of course, and also a very problematic relationship between the food markets and the energy markets, so that when the prices of oil and gas increase, as they have in 2022, the prices of food commodities increase, leading families in poverty to struggle to make ends meet and to be able to feed themselves. So it's a very problematic situation in which we are. We need to de-link food production from energy, and we need to combat speculation on commodities markets in order to reduce that impact on families in poverty.
And you mentioned it briefly there, conflict. I mean, there are so many different conflicts around the world. Of course, everybody thinks of Ukraine, but also places like Sudan, like Haiti, all of these sort of building and making the problem far worse as well.
Right, and once households migrate from the place where they have their herds and their agricultural fields and so on, and move to somewhere else, they depend entirely from humanitarian aid, which is very problematic. And the problem is we have no system by which aid is provided immediately on time to populations in need. Between the moment when the World Food Programme declares there to be a famine and the moment when the World Food Programme can provide support, 3, 4, 6 months elapse that are extremely crucial in the ability for the WFP to support populations. And I think we should realize that the current system is one in which we seem to be recruiting firefighters when the fire is declared, and that is simply not a workable scheme. We need to be much better equipped to respond to crisis.
Yeah, how do you do that? I mean, presumably as well you have to foresee problems before they happen as well in your job.
Well, there exists a food assistance convention that is a commitment by major donor countries to support populations in need by providing food aid, but the food assistance convention is not working well. There is no commitment by rich countries to provide support to the World Food Programme and to respond to the humanitarian appeals. I was, for example, recently in Bangladesh, where 1 million Rohingya refugees on the border of Myanmar are supported by humanitarian agencies, including the World Food Programme, and only about 25% of the appeal of the UN agencies for support has been responded to. So the food rations for the refugees have been cut significantly over the past 3-4 months. And that is simply not acceptable. We need a system by which rich countries commit to providing support when the World Food Programme needs that kind of support. Otherwise, we will continue to see an insufficient response to humanitarian disasters.
Now, one of the main issues that you talk about in your book now, Changer de boussole, is your argument that this drive for growth, which virtually every country has around the world, is just actually starting to prove fatal, in fact, particularly, of course, for rich countries. And it's just unrealistic for us to keep aiming that way.
There is a phase of development during which growth is not only useful but indispensable, when you have to provide health, education, housing to populations, satisfy their essential needs. But beyond a certain point, the search for growth becomes counterproductive. When all the needs have been satisfied, you need the economy to be, stationary and prosperous. You don't need ever more growth. If you search more growth, you then are led to make policy choices that actually create exclusion, increase inequalities. For example, by liberalizing trade, by reducing taxes on corporations or reducing the regulatory burdens on corporations, by intensifying work in the search of increased work productivity and so on. We end up not only crossing planetary boundaries, destroying the ecosystems, we also end up exhausting the men and women that work in the economy in the search for growth. So there comes a point where growth becomes counterproductive, creating the very exclusion that growth was meant to allow us to challenge. And I think that is a point that we in rich countries reached in the mid-1970s. It is the point which other countries will soon be reaching. We still need growth in certain poor countries, but for rich countries, we need a different model of development that does not rely on growth as a solution to all societal challenges.
And as you hinted to there, and you say in your book as well, it's also about the fact that the planet just can't handle it anymore either.
We are deluding ourselves if we continue to think that we can infinitely grow human activities and the metabolism of economic systems, the use of energy and matter, in a planet with finite resources. 50 years ago, the Club of Rome published the Limits to Growth book, showing that we could not continue to use resources and to produce waste and pollution that the ecosystems are meant to absorb infinitely. And they actually estimated that the collapse would occur around 2030, perhaps a bit later. The curves they had been drawing then in 1972 have proven to be very, very exact. The updates of the Club of Rome work of 1972 have shown the predictions to be very close to the reality of the development seen back then. And so I think we indeed should realize that infinite growth is not possible in a finite planet.
That's 7 years' time, 2030. How on earth do you change people's mindsets? Because everybody, well, not everybody, but the vast majority of people have been looking for growth for years now. Changing that is almost impossible, isn't it?
We need to realize that prosperity, happiness, well-being do not depend on the accumulation of material wealth. And people can lead very healthy and enjoyable lives without having always more year after year. And it is this mindset we should change. It means, for example, reducing working time. It means providing more public services and perhaps reducing the need to accumulate private goods. It means investing in public transport system rather than in individual cars being more used on the roads and so on. So there are many ways in which we can create prosperity, shared prosperity benefiting all groups of the population without increasing our economic output.
Great message to send out today. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme. Olivier De Schutter, the UN's Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Extreme Poverty. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Today.